have a month. Because then you kind of, is that right, Travis? You the same way? You got one shot, you got 40 minutes to cover whatever topic you're going to try to deal with. And so I'd been, well, just turn your Bibles to Nehemiah chapter 1. I'm going to take a text there. We're not going to read it through, but we are going to keep going back to that text in the course of this study. And while you're turning to Nehemiah chapter 1, I want to give you a little background information on what's going on here. In about 606 BC, the nation of Judah was carried into Babylonian captivity by what man? What? Who carried Judah into Babylonian captivity in 606 BC? Nebuchadnezzar. Yep. Some 19 years later, about 586 BC, we find the temple of God there in Jerusalem being ransacked, destroyed, and partially burned. Now, I won't say it's totally burned, but it was pretty well destroyed for all intents and purposes. However, some 47 years later, during the first year of the reign of Cyrus, by the way, who was Cyrus? He was king of Persia. During the first reign of Cyrus, the king of Persia, he made a proclamation saying that all of the Jews, now remember they're captives, right? But he came out with his proclamation and said, hey, any of you Jews, you Hebrews that want to go back to your homeland, you're free to go. Now that was unprecedented for a conquering king to release captives. Why would that be a bad idea politically? What? Yeah, maybe some, but I think there are a couple of other things even more. Steve? Yeah, well, that'd be the upside. But think of the tax revenue, right? Remember, you're conquered, and the conquering king would tell the conquerees, I guess it'd be conquerees. Anyway, your captives, okay, you're welcome to live here, but we expect, and they would usually say, okay, so many talents of gold, so many talents of silver, so much wool, so much wheat, whatever. There would be a price to pay, and they would be allowed to govern themselves. Even when they were in Roman dominion in New Testament times, they were allowed to pretty well control themselves, make their own political choices with some restrictions such as the death penalty, but they had to provide a tariff, a tax, if you will. So Cyrus is giving up all this tax revenue, and not only that, Israel has a history of what? Rebellion. He might, 10 years, 20 years, he may have to go resubjugate them. Yes, David?
But the flip side of that, all of the skilled workers and leaders and everything have been taken.
Yeah.
And like the first son of them, maybe he's thinking he's fine, he's moving up, get more revenue.
Possibly. But Steve made a good point. They're going to be allies. And they were, I'm sure, very appreciative of this decree. Now, of course, this had been prophesied long before Cyrus was even born. You've got to remember that. God, through the prophet, had said that this Cyrus, he wasn't born, was going to be raised up, and that he was going to let them go back. And according to Ezra chapter 1 and verse 3, there were some 42,320. Yeah, 42,320. Who decided, hey, let's go back home. Now you got to realize most of these people have never even seen their homeland. They've been born in captivity. They are, for all intents and purposes, they're almost Persian. Because that's where they were born, that's where they've lived, that's where they worked. Many of them spoke. And it was during this time that the Hebrews began to lose their native tongue. Because they, of course, picked up the language of their neighbors, their captors. And of course, later, after this 42,000 went back, there were two other groups of exiles who later decided to go back. Now, some 4 years later, about 535 BC, they began to rebuild the temple, which was a very noble cause. Rebuild the house of God. But what happens? Okay, they started building their own houses, doing their own vineyards and orchards, and doing their own thing. And what happened to the work on the temple? Okay. Now later we find that with the help of Haggai and Zechariah, that work was finally completed. And later in 458 BC, Ezra comes back with another group of captives that he leads back, and he begins to make some religious reforms because the people had been restored physically, but spiritually they were still a long way from where they ought to be. They were not what they should have been. And so Ezra comes on the scene, and he begins trying to teach and to bring the people back to where God would have them. Now Nehemiah comes on the scene about 445 BC, and he begins reconstruction of the city because at this point the walls, we're told, they're torn down. Their whole section's missing. A lot of them are crumbled. Where the gates were, the gates had been burned. And there was a lot of rubble. I mean, the city walls were a joke. They provided no defense. And in chapter 1 of our text, news comes to Nehemiah just how the situation was, what the plight was for the Jews in Jerusalem. Now, for all Nehemiah knew, because remember, well, I don't want to get ahead of myself. For all Nehemiah knows at this point, everything's just fine. All these Jews have gone back. They've rebuilt their houses. They've rebuilt the temple by now. And if the city walls aren't completed, they ought to be well on their way to having the city back in shape. But he gets word that's not the situation. Remember now, this been how long since they went back? 90. I'll say if you kept those numbers in your head that I was giving you. It's been 90 years since they went back, and the walls still are crumbled, destroyed. The city is a shambles. In fact, look at Nehemiah chapter 1, 1 through 3. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. And it came to pass in the month of Chisleu in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan the palace, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came, he and certain men of Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews that had escaped, which were left of the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said unto me, the remnant that are left of the captivity there in the province are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem also is broken down, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. This is not a good picture that's painted to Nehemiah. In fact, what does Nehemiah do when he hears this? Look at verse 4. He begins to weep. Not only does he weep, he fasted and he prayed for the people there. Now, I guess we ought to stop here. Who was Nehemiah? Who are we talking about here? Okay, he was the cupbearer to the Persian monarch Artaxerxes. And by the way, there were two Artaxerxes in history. One's known as Artaxerxes the first, and the second was Artaxerxes the second. I almost hesitate to even tell you that, but kind of obvious. Artaxerxes 1, Artaxerxes 2. Now, George said he was the cupbearer for the king. What was the cupbearer? He was the food tester. Not really a taster. I mean, he wouldn't taste it. Needs a little salt, Your Highness. The soup's a little cool tonight. No, his job was what? To make sure there was no hemlock, which was the poison of choice of that day. And so they would bring the king the food. The cupbearer would take a sip out of the king's cup. Of course, you can imagine the king's watching what kind of reactions, And then he would sample all of the foods that were brought in. And if I've read, I don't recall, but how long they waited before eating, it might take a while for the poison, but you can imagine the king's hungry, he's watching. Is he going to die? Is he going to kick over? What's going to happen here? So finally he'd be convinced, okay, the food's okay. Wouldn't you like a job like that? Being the guinea pig, knowing how many enemies your boss might have. Now the cupbearer, again, he was the most trusted of all the king's servants. And ironically, the king's most trusted servant was what? A captive. He was a Jew. Enemy. It's the letter E. He was the enemy. I mean, would you want your enemy testing your food? I'd want my brother or somebody that I had some confidence in. I wouldn't want some foreigner that probably hates me because I've ripped him and his family out of their homeland and brought them over here by force and made them live. not the ideal situation as we see it, but obviously the king had confidence in Nehemiah here. But the fact is, even though he was trusted, even though the king must have appreciated him, he was still a slave. And so for Nehemiah to suggest something as bold and brazen as, by the way, king, I'd like to go back and rebuild the city walls of my homeland. That would be tantamount to what? Treason, right. I mean, because the Jews had and that's going to come up later, because the enemies of the Jews send word to the king, the next king, and say, hey, if you'll search your records, these Jews are a what? They are a rebellious people. They're seditious. They've caused problems for every king for years. You don't want them to rebuild the city. And so you can imagine, here's Nehemiah torn. He wants to go back and do something to help his people and to help rebuild the city. But to suggest this to the king might not be a good idea. And yet, Nehemiah was a man who was convinced that there was a work to be done, and he was convinced that he was the one to do it. Now, we would probably ask, if we were in Nehemiah's situation, well, let me ask it as a question. What would we have asked if we'd been in Nehemiah's situation? You know, we got a decent job. Yes, it's a high-risk job, but still, probably paid pretty good. Got to eat well. Got to hang out with the king and queen. Not a lot of manual labor. But he was still a slave. You get word that things aren't going too well at home, which is a long way off. And by the way, I've never been home anyway. That's not my native land. What would our reaction have been? What do we say today? One of the most common expressions heard. Not my problem, but another one. That's a good one too. Andy, you want to say something there? Not my job. Come on, I thought this would be the first one you ought to come out with. Somebody ought to do something, right? We hear that in the church. A problem comes up, there's a need, somebody ought to do something. And maybe the elders ought to do something. Those deacons ought to do something. Or that preacher ought to do something. And what about you? Oh, no. Then it's not my job. That's the next thing. Not my job. It'll let them take care of it. That's their problem. But yet Nehemiah wanted to do something. He didn't say somebody ought to do something. It's what can I do? And we're not going to have time to go through, and I really hope you'll go home tonight or tomorrow. Read the book of Nehemiah. It's a very short book. And it's really interesting once you get the background, kind of know what's going on, but get the whole story. But the key to Nehemiah being able to do what he does was prayer. We look at Nehemiah and you say, wow, how could one man, a former slave, accomplish what he did? And I think the answer is found here in the book, through prayer. And it kind of reminds us what does James say about prayer in James chapter 5 and verse 16, about the prayer of a righteous man. The effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. We might paraphrase that, it accomplishes much. It can do great things. And we see that illustrated here in the life. And again, we don't have time to go into it, but we find 4 different kinds of prayers that Nehemiah prays in this book. In chapter 1 and verse 5, he offers a prayer of praise to God. In chapter 1, verse 6 and 7, it's a prayer of penitence. And then verse 8 through 10, it's prompting, if you will. And then finally, chapter 1 and verse 11, he gets around to his petition. Now, yes, he asked God to do something, but before asking, he praises, he reminds God of certain promises. He goes through these other things, and we can learn something. Oftentimes, our prayer life is kind of like a kid's Christmas list to Santa, except it's, Dear God, give me this, this, and this. God, I need this, that, and that. Nehemiah doesn't do that. I mean, had we been in his shoes, first thing, God, we've got a problem. You need to do something. But instead, he praises God. He prays for forgiveness for himself and for the people. That's what I'm calling the prayer of penance. But anyway, Let's look first of all at this prayer of praise in verse 5, chapter 1. And said, I beseech thee, O Lord God of heaven, the great and terrible God that keepeth covenant and mercy for them that love him and observe his commandments. Now look carefully at what's said here. He addresses him as the Lord God of heaven. Lord means master. And that's obviously God's position of authority. As God, he is Lord. He is our master. He's the master of heaven where he dwells. And so Nehemiah knew where to go for help. He doesn't go to the king and ask for armies. He doesn't go to the king and ask for building materials or carpentry. To God for the help that he needs. And notice he addresses God as the great and terrible. Now actually the word terrible there, the way we would use it today, the New King James uses the word, and that really better, I think, sets forth the idea here, because it was God who had the power. God had the power to bless. God had the power to destroy. And Nehemiah recognizes God's ability to make. In other words, God, we've got a problem. He turns it over to God, doesn't he? He respects God's ability to deal with his problem. He says, that keepeth covenant and mercy for them that love him and observe his commandments. He's reminding God here, but I don't think that's to those who were faithful to him. And he's confident that God will be faithful to them. Even though, as he's later, he had not been faithful to God. They certainly weren't deserving, if you will, of this blessing. And of course, I guess the take home for us is, if we're going to make a difference in our world today, if we're going to make a difference in our community, if we're going to make a difference in our congregations today, we're going to have to recognize the source of all help is God. It's not to go to the elders, to go to the preacher, to go to the deacons, to have meetings and discuss, but ultimately we've got to accept the fact God is the only one who can help. And notice I say help. It's not, we don't just say, okay, God, do something. Dump it in God's lap. We've got to be willing to do what God would have us to do to solve the problem. And we've got to trust in his power to whatever it is that's needed. And again, having to hurry here. Notice verses 6 and 7. Nehemiah prays a prayer of penance here, which of course is essential. He says, let thine ear now be attentive and thine eyes open, that thou mayest hear the prayer of thy servant, which I pray before thee now, day and night, for the children of Israel thy servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel which we have sinned against thee. And then notice, he doesn't talk about what they've done. He says, both my father's house have sinned. We have dealt very corruptly against thee, and have not kept the commandments, nor the statutes, nor the judgment which thou commandest thy servant Moses. Notice he begins by saying, God, please hear my prayer. Why do you think God always hears prayer, doesn't he? Why would he ask God to hear his prayer? Okay. He realized because of their sin that really he doesn't have a right to expect God to listen. I mean, he knows. He's very specific here. Things they've done. They've been corrupt. They've not kept the commandments. They've not kept the statutes. They've not kept the They had no right to expect God. Trusting in the mercy of God. And so it's not they have sinned or those Jews have sinned. There. And of course, Nehemiah realized that before he could make a difference, he's going to, shall we say, straighten out, acknowledge some things in the lives of the people. for us as Christians, we're not going to be able to make a difference until we're willing to admit our wrong. Until we acknowledge sin. What's the matter? Can't you hear me, Sonny? Hello? What? Yeah, I'm going through the change. I was talking loud. But anyways, Christians, we don't have a right to expect God to hear our prayers. We don't have a right to expect God to answer our prayers as long as there are things in our lives that are not we make no effort to make right. Proverbs 28:13 says, "He that covereth his sin shall not prosper, but whoso confesseth and forsaketh him shall have mercy." Psalm 66:18, "If I regard iniquity in my heart," and then New King James says, "if I cherish," that translation says, "if I hold on to wickedness or iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear me." And a lot of other verses that bear examples. So I recognize the need for not only acknowledging sin, but for making it right. And so right here in the very beginning of his prayer, he asked God to forgive them. Can you hear me, Bob? Okay. That's about as close as I can get it. Of course, James 5:16 talks about confession. He says, "Confess your faults one to another, and pray one for another, that ye may be healed. The effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much." Now, a lot of times people don't understand what this idea of confession is. We need to avoid, vague generalities. Well, if I have sinned, or if I have offended someone, I mean, we usually, there might be, I'm not going to say never, there might be circumstances where we're not sure. But, generally we know if we've done something, and we need to make that right specifically. And of course, the confession needs to be as specific as the sin. If it's a private sin, suppose Travis and I got into it, and maybe I acted in a very unchristian manner. I need to go to Travis and make that right. That's not something I have to go down front and make right in a public way, because nobody would know what's going on. Now, if I did it in a class, in a situation where everybody's here, I'd need to make that right publicly, because it's a public sin. If I acted in an unchristian way in his presence. Any comments? I don't mean to get talking. I'm just trying to watch the clock. Got a lot of material to cover here in a short time. Travis.
I was struck with this is a different book, that not only the minor prophets do it, Nehemiah does it, praying for the nation, praying for other sins, but how Job would do that for his family, praying for his sins, or his sons and daughters' sins, if they had.
Yeah.
I always find that interesting. Sometimes it seems it's very easy to my outlook. I've done this and this and this and this. And something can point fingers at other people who bring them in saying, hey, we're all in this boat to watch out for it. It's just impressive to me how he does that.
And you're right. I hadn't thought about the fact that the minor prophets, at least some of the minor prophets, do the same thing. And of course, here's another thing. Nehemiah is going to help answer this prayer when he goes back, because what does he do? He tries to bring the people back to God. He tries to bring about this reformation, if you will, because they're pretty rotten at this point. And it's not a matter of he's going to pray for God to forgive them and overlook all these things and then just life go on. I mean, he goes after them. When they start this rebuilding and these things are going on, he deals with some of these sins, some of these issues in a very forthright way. All right, let's notice the next one, verses 8 through 10. And this one always strikes me as rather almost humorous, because he's reminding God, as though God would forget or as though God didn't remember what had been said. Notice, remember I beseech thee the word that thou, speaking to God, remember I beseech thee the word that thou commandest thy servant Moses, saying, if ye transgress, I will scatter you abroad among the nations. But if you turn unto me and keep my commandments and do them, though they were of you cast out unto the uttermost parts of the heaven, yet will I gather them from thence, and will bring them into the place that I have chosen to set my name there. Now these are thy servants and thy people, whom thou hast redeemed by thy great power and by thy strong hand. So he's reminding God of the promise that God made. And then he reminds, hey, these are your people. You know, they're not in the land that you gave them. They're not in their homeland. And of course, that's because of what you said. If they sin, they're going to be taken away. By the way, what does this remind you of? Another passage in the Old Testament. How about 1 Chronicles 7 and verse 14? You want to read that for me, Travis? 1 Chronicles chapter 7 and verse 14 is very similar, I think, as far as the idea here.
The sons of Manasseh.
Nope. If my people, which are called by my name. That's what happens when you rely on your memory. No comments. If my people, which are called by my name. Is it 2 Chronicles? Okay, I said first. Thank you. Is it 7:14? Okay. All right, I'm corrected. 2 Chronicles 7:14. Travis?
If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sin and will heal their land.
Okay. That's what Nehemiah is doing, isn't it? One man. But it's got to start with one. And God tells them, if they will do these things, he will hear. And that's exactly what we have. You know, God hears this plea. Anyway, Nehemiah asked God to listen to his prayer along with those who fear his name. And I think he recognizes the importance of attitude, if you will, in addressing God in prayer. He recognized the importance of others who hopefully were praying the same thing. And he may have had others praying with him. We're just not told. But he asked God to give him success here. Notice verse 11. O Lord, I beseech thee, let now thine ear be attentive to the prayer of thy servant, and to the prayer of thy servants, who desire to fear thy name and prosper. I pray thee, thy servant, this day, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man, for I was the king's cupbearer. Now, Nehemiah, of course, we've read the book, so we know what's going to happen. But Nehemiah is about to take a very bold and a very brazen step. What's that? He's going to go to the king and say, hey, I want a sabbatical. I want to leave. I want to go back to my homeland. I want to go back and take care of some of these problems. And so he's asking God to be with him. And perhaps he told some of the other Jews who worked with him in the court, we're just not told, to pray with him that God will give him success. It's interesting because Nehemiah just didn't ask for God's help. But basically, he says, I want you to help me. Give me success in doing what I'm about to do. And that is to give him favor in the sight of God. Somebody start to say something? Okay, thought I heard somebody speak. Of course, Nehemiah understood it would be impossible for his plan to succeed unless God was with him. And of course, with us, when we go to God in prayer, we need to understand the right attitude. We don't go to God and say, okay, God, you got to do something. Okay, God, I've served you all these years. You need to grant me this. We need to always pray very humbly. You know, he's the potter, we're the clay, we're the servants, he is the Lord. And we need to pray his will be done. We need to pray for what's best because we don't always know what's best. And the fact that God is not always going to give us everything that we ask. Now, will God give us everything we need to succeed in doing what he's told us to do? Yes. Now, here's the kicker though. What I think we might need to succeed is not what God says I need to succeed. And so when we pray, we've always got to realize that, hey, God may have a bigger plan. God may have a better plan. God may have something totally different in mind than what I do. And we have to accept the fact that my plans are mortal. My plans are human. And I think elders if they're what there ought to be. Elders are going to understand this. They may have great plans for evangelism, for outreach, or for whatever, but that may not be God's plan. The way. I'm talking about the method. And sometimes our plans get changed. And so we have to be, what was the word of the day at camp a few years ago, Bill? Wasn't it flexible? Flexible. We have to be flexible in God's Word. Not flexible with doctrine. I mean, doctrine doesn't change, but how we carry out the Great Commission. What worked in the 50s might not work today. And what works today may not work in 20 years. So we have to be flexible. We have to adapt. And again, I want to emphasize, not about changing the gospel, changing the truth, but I'm talking about our method of carrying out the work. We have to be flexible. Of course, when we... there's so many things that we need to be asking God to help us to do, like Nehemiah. Of course, he had a focus. He had one thing that he was trying to do to get permission. By the way, what did the king do? When he goes to the king there and asks for permission to go back, what happened? Okay, chapter 2, you're right. Chapter 2 and verse 1, it's interesting. And it came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes the king, that wine was before him, and I took up the wine and gave it unto the king. Now I had not been before time sad in his presence. So up until this point, he's always been, it would seem, bubbly, outgoing, happy. And in verse 2, wherefore the king said unto me, why is thy countenance sad, seeing thou art not sick? This is nothing else but sorrow of heart. And then I was sore afraid. Why do you think he said, then I was sore afraid? The king says, look, this is not, not allergies, it's not a cold, you're not physically sick. This is something else. Yeah. Now, he was kind of worried. The king says, hey, this is nothing else but heartache. Sorrow, which could have been taken the wrong way, as Bill pointed out. And in verse 3, he speaks up rather boldly to the king, but again, because of his situation, he could speak boldly, maybe more boldly than the average servant could have. In verse 3, and then I said unto the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my countenance be sad when the city, the place of my father's sepulchres, and we would say tombs, when the place of my father's sepulchres lieth waste, and the gates thereof are consumed with fire? So what's he doing here? Setting him up. Yeah, the king, you ask, the king said, what's the problem? So he tells him, why shouldn't I be sorrowful? Why shouldn't I be sad? And then he explains the situation. Now, do you think Artaxerxes had given even a passing thought to that little city of Jerusalem that was lying in ruin? Probably not. He may not have even made the connection between Nehemiah and the city of Jerusalem, because remember, the Jews came from all over, not just the city of Jerusalem. So the king asks, he tells him there, here's the problems, why shouldn't I be sad? And then in verse 4, and you can see the providential hand of God working here, because the average king of that day would have probably said, oh well, get over it. You've got a good job here. What's your problem? They didn't care about the well-being, much less the happiness or sorrow of a servant. And the word servant here is just a nice word for what? A slave. We think of a servant as a nanny, like the British. They have servants, a butler, or what are some others? Well, housekeepers, they have the servants, and they're paid. The nanny gets tired of the job, she quits. She turns in her notice, she leaves. But the servant, like Nehemiah couldn't quit. If he walked away, he wouldn't get very far. Because he was a slave. Literally a bondservant is the word that Paul uses in the New Testament for people like this. But the king shows his interest and says in verse 4, "For what dost thou make request?" Don't you know Nehemiah breathed a sigh of relief because the king's not mad, the king's not upset. The king says, "What do you want? What are you asking?" And you can just almost visualize Nehemiah going, whew. He's over that hurdle. And then it's interesting, what does he do? The latter part of verse 4. He prays. There's a man who understood. I mean, here you got the king waiting for your answer, but he takes time to pray. And he says in verse 5, "If it please the king, and if thy servant have found favor in thy sight, that thou wouldest send me unto Judah, to the city of my father's sepulchres, that I may build." Wait a minute, Nehemiah. Whoa, whoa, whoa. I thought you were just wanting to go back for a visit. You want to rebuild that rebellious city? I mean, is that what you're telling me? And the king said unto me, verse 6, and by the way, the queen was sitting beside him, the text says. "And the king said unto me, For how long shall thy journey be, and when wilt thou return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time." Now that says something about the value that the king placed upon Nehemiah. How long are you going to be gone? When are you coming back? You know, maybe the king was expressing concern, but more than likely, who's going to test my food? You know, what am I going to do while you're gone? So when are you leaving? How long are you going to be gone? And in verse 7, "Moreover, I said to the king, If it please the king, let letters be given me to the governors beyond the river, that they may convey me over." Literally there, I think the American Standard says, "Let me pass through till I come into Judah." You can understand the problem. These governors of the Persian Empire, they see this stray Jew wandering alone, or maybe with a small group. What are they going to think? He's getting away. He's an escapee. And so naturally, he's got to have something showing, hey, I'm not a runaway servant. I'm on the king's business. So he asked the king what? Give me letters to these governors of the king's land beyond the river, that they will let me pass. They won't try to stop me until I get to Judah. And then in verse 8, he asked for another letter unto Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the palace, which appertaineth to the house, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall enter into. And the king granted me according to the good hand of God upon me. Now verse 9 begins the next section of the chapter. That's why I'm encouraging you to go home and read some more, and maybe tomorrow I finish the book, because Nehemiah is an amazing book, because we see not only the tenacity of this man Nehemiah, his determination to do something, we see the providential hand of God working in the background. We see the stubbornness of Nehemiah, because he does not let those honored Jews keep him down. He's going to do it, and he's not going to let them discourage him. Questions or comments? All right. It's about time for the bell. As far as I've got. So, oh, it just rang? Okay.